All right, welcome everyone to today's American Physical Society Forum on Physics and Society and Journal of Science Policy and Governance co-hosted expert panel on foreign policy and national security. My name is Julia McCall. I co-direct the Precision Medicine program in the state of California in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and I am honored to be joined today by two luminaries in the science and technology policy field, Dr. Kate Weber and Dr. Michael Stebbins, alongside my colleagues at the American Physical Society, Dr. Henry Kelly, as well as the Journal of Science Policy and Governance student ambassador, Bipin Kumar. Today's program, as I mentioned, is co-hosted by American Physical Society Forum on Physics and Society. With us today to provide a brief introduction of the organization is Dr. Henry Kelly, who is past chair of APS FPS and a senior fellow at the Boston University Institute for Global Sustainability. He's an expert in technology policy and has worked extensively on energy, information, education technology, and nuclear weapons in particular. He served in the Clinton administration as Principal Associate Director for Environment and Energy in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, in the Obama administration as Associate Director for Technology, as well as President of the Federation of American Scientists, Senior Associate at the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment, and Assistant Director of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, as it's known today. Dr. Kelly, I'd love to hand the microphone to you.
Well, thank you for the very kind introduction. I think my remarks are probably going to be shorter than my introduction. I wanted to thank the journal for partnering with us. The Forum on Physics and Society is a component of the American Physical Society, which is a professional society of physicists worldwide. And one of our, we were founded in the early 1970s with an early focus on nuclear arms control, but have since expanded into a variety of different science policy challenges. And one of the things that we're keenly interested in is making sure that there's a flow of young early career people into this policy world where we think physical scientists can play a crucial role. So this journal is a wonderful opportunity, and I thank them for their willingness to participate with us. And with that, I'll go back to Joanne.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly. It's been an honor to partner with you on this. For those of you unfamiliar with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, we are almost 11-year-old internationally recognized open access peer. We'd like to think of our serving as a vehicle for students and early career scholars to publish articles concerning every corner of science and technology policy. We, in addition to serving as a journal, we're an independent platform for, again, students and early career scholars to engage and contribute to the policymaking process at all levels of government. How this looks in practice are a series of webinars, writing workshops, and additional career development opportunities, including a certificate program on occasion, participation in the editorial board, as well as an internship program, of which Mr. Bipin Kumar is our wonderful ambassador today. We recognize that, while there's a valley of death between the generation of knowledge and the application of that knowledge, that same pattern exists in the policy world as well. And we want to make sure that the information is reaching the eyes and the minds of those with decision-making capacity. So we submit proposals for conference panels that feature our authors. We interview those authors in podcast episodes, as well as engage the media in all sorts of ways. Today's event is leading up to April 30th deadline of the special issue on policy and governance on science, technology, and global security. It's the final event of a series of 3. Our previous 2 events have been uploaded to YouTube. So feel free to browse the various resources in addition to spectacular workshops and webinars of previous issues. Today's event, again, focused on foreign policy and national security, feature two visionaries in the biosecurity and technology policy space. As soon as I figure out how to change my screen, there we are. Never a dull moment with technology here. So I'm honored to introduce our two panelists today. Dr. Kate Weber leads global public policy for emerging technologies research at Google. That includes artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and robotics. Her career has focused on the intersection of scientific research and policy. Prior to Google, she led a team at the US Department of State covering bilateral and multilateral engagement on chemicals management, air quality, and waste management, where she was also a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. Additionally, Dr. Weber's role as Foreign Affairs Officer within the US Department of State allowed her to lead engagement on issues through multilateral environmental agreements, international organizations, and foreign assistance program management. She holds a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Cambridge, where she was a Marshall Scholar. Dr. Weber, I would love to hand the microphone to you to provide about 5 minutes of further introductory material as you are comfortable.
Yeah, thank you, Julianne, and it's great to be here. So I guess you heard kind of the details of my resume. It's kind of a varied path. I ended up somewhere very far from where I started. Who knows where I'll go next? But as Julianne mentioned, throughout this, I've been focused on working at the intersection of the scientists doing research and those who are discussing policies to either fund that research or think about how it affects society and what policies need to be in place to address that. So I think for the purposes of this discussion today, I'll talk a bit about my work at Google and what I cover, and also just how my background as a molecular biologist, having worked at the State Department, shapes that work that I do today. So as mentioned, I lead our global public policy for AI and other emerging technologies, which means working both with the people doing the AI research, the people deploying AI and other technologies in Google products, and then also with our public policy teams across the world who are talking to governments about what they should be doing on AI regulation, investment in emerging technologies, export controls, other kinds of like national security policies. And so super important to understand, like, okay, if you take that last example of export controls, you know, the US government is very focused on stopping China from getting access to emerging technologies, like many of those that Google is working on, quantum computing, AI. They will sometimes come to us with a proposal, say, oh, we'd like to put an export control on a quantum computer that has 100 or more quantum bits or something. And so it's important to have somebody in a position like mine who understands enough about what's happening on the research team to be able to immediately say, like, hey, that's not a good idea because the number of quantum bits or qubits doesn't actually correlate to the performance of a quantum computer. You should be looking at all these other aspects of quantum computers if you're thinking about controlling a technology that has the potential to have some kind of adverse impact in the world. And then I also know I know many of the key researchers on the team, and so I know who to go to when I don't have the answer to a question or when I think we need to bring deeper expertise into a discussion with government. On the AI side, you know, doing a lot of thinking right now about not just how do we respond to all of the calls for regulation and the pressure to manage risks as this technology develops very fast, but also like how can we be thinking 3 steps ahead on what we're doing in our own products, the guardrails we have in place to stop AI technologies from being used for misinformation, or to surface harmful information from the web, like all of these kinds of questions. So that's what I'm doing now. I did sort of analogous work when I was at the State Department, but in a totally different topic. I was working in that case with experts across the US government, primarily at the EPA, on topics like chemicals management, air quality management. And then in that case, it was sort of translating the US government technical expertise to diplomat speak, State Department speak, representing the US government in international negotiations, kind of figuring out what the US government position should be on how the US, Canada, and Europe manage air quality in our region. Like what should be the thresholds that we look at for, what do countries have to do in terms of like setting pollution limits, that kind of thing. So very different topic, but similar kind of work in that there's this talking to the technical experts and then talking to the people making the policies who often don't speak the same language.
Dr. Weber, thank you so much for that brilliant introduction and window into to your work and perspective. I'm delighted to move on to introduce our next panelist before a full panel discussion, including questions from our audience. So those of you in attendance, please do start brainstorming some questions for our illustrious panelists and placing them in the chat as you wish. So Dr. Stebbins, our other panelist, is a geneticist and public policy expert who served as the Assistant Director for Biotechnology in the Obama White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he worked on issues ranging from the antibiotic resistance crisis to restoring pollinator health and everything in between. He is currently the president of Science Advisors, a science and health consulting firm he founded in 2018 to provide guidance to companies, philanthropies, and nonprofit organizations. He previously served as the Vice President of Science and Technology for the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. He also served as Director of Biology Policy at the Federation of American Scientists and was a senior editor at Nature Genetics. He earned a PhD in genetics at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. Dr. Stebbins, it's an honor to have you with us.
Thank you so much. And thank you to you and Henry for inviting me to speak. Like Kate, I had sort of a circuitous path, as you heard. I was a geneticist working in a lab doing fun things, and then became an editor and got tired of hearing myself complain about the Bush administration. That's how long I've been in Washington, so about 2004. And then came down expecting to take a flamethrower to Washington and for a year or two and then leave. Then a career happened. I wound up working in the US Senate on stem cells for then Minority Leader Harry Reid, and then at the Federation of American Scientists. And then Henry and I actually wound up being two of the first science advisors to the Obama campaign. And then I wound up on the transition, working on the transition team, and then in the White House before heading out on my own. In the White House, I really embraced this idea of being a policy entrepreneur. So in addition to reacting to what's going on in the world, we would identify major issues that we thought that we could make some real headway on. And that ranged from access to scientific publications and data, antibiotic resistance, you heard, mental health issues. It was really spanned the range of issues related to health and biotechnology. And I was very fortunate in being able to do that. More recently, in my current role, I work in a very similar way. I identify issues and that I think that we can make headway on, and then I just have to get someone to pay me to do it, which is not so bad. So most recently, or most notable of my work since doing that was developing the proposal for and then driving through the Biden campaign for a new federal agency modeled on DARPA, but focused on health, which is currently, it's called ARPA-H. So we birthed a new federal agency, to really start to address some of the core issues that are in the center of the biotechnology space. And that is that there's this massive hole in the middle. We have what the government funds on one side, that's a basic science research, and on the other side is more applied research that the private sector funds. And in the middle is what we call the valley of death, and that is difficult to span, and it is an artifact of the way that we fund science, and that was the reason why we pushed ARPA-H. But it's also relevant to our discussion today in the way that we address central issues in and around security. Biosecurity in particular, and public health. And so when we dive in, I'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, thank you for having me on.
Dr. Stebbins, it's a total privilege. Thank you both, Dr. Weber and Dr. Stebbins. We now have about 35 minutes for a full panel discussion. As I invited previously, anyone in attendance is welcome and encouraged to submit your questions. We have such extreme expertise represented on this panel that we could truly talk for hours about any one topic. We want to make sure that those in attendance with an interest in potentially submitting an article for the special issue has an opportunity to pose the questions that are most of interest. So please don't be shy. We want to know what you are most curious about and want to engage our panel in. To get started, I would love for our panelists to provide an example of a recent evidence-based science and technology policy and what the process was, who the stakeholders were, and how that got done. We know too often, right, evidence doesn't lead to substantial policy change. So when it does, we want to take note of how it happened and how it could potentially replicate. So Dr. Weber, if I could start with you in a AI or relevant policy issue.
Sure, and I guess I would start by saying that in the space I'm working in, I think this process is happening right now. So I'm going to use an example of an ongoing discussion where I think there is this ongoing push and pull between evidence-based proposals and sort of general concerns and addressing public concerns about technologies. I think the biggest, many of you have probably heard, well, everybody is talking about AI right now and how to regulate AI, how to control AI, right? I think there isn't actually, there hasn't been a lot done in this space so far beyond, like on the US side, there's an AI risk management framework that NIST has in place. There's a lot of sort of voluntary like standards development, best practices development, but we're really at the cusp of the first AI focused regulation in Europe, and Google has been very involved in those discussions and in thinking through like how do you ask companies to manage the risks of AI in a way that is practical, and who should be doing what are kind of the key sort of questions in that debate. So the EU AI Act, it lays out this framework of classifying different kinds of AI systems as high risk or low risk, depending on what kinds of tasks they're used for. Something used in like a healthcare setting would likely be high risk. Something used just for sort of, finding your local coffee shop would be lower risk. And there's, I think that process by and large has been very evidence-based. Like what are the kinds of applications we should be concerned about? Like, let's not put in place controls on every AI system. There's an exemption for research and development, right? It's kind of designed to allow for that innovation. What we've seen that's interesting, which has the potential to kind of shift that balance away from the evidence base, is the growing concern about how fast this technology is moving and kind of lack of understanding for how you can slow it down and avoid negative impact. So I think it's an interesting case study of like, and that has resulted in proposals to amend the initial AI Act proposal to just classify all general purpose AI as high risk, as an example. Now, a general purpose AI model is one that can be used for multiple downstream tasks. So maybe it could be used, if it's a model that helps with navigation, maybe it could be used to direct emergency services, or it could be used for that example I gave earlier, right, to find a coffee shop. Like, one of those is a much higher risk task than the other, but the new proposals would just call all of those models high risk. What that does is requires companies to kind of lay out all the potential applications of their technology, think through what risk management practices might be across every potential application. That's not typically the way, like, we don't actually know every one of those applications. That's creating obligations on us that we're unlikely to be able to follow through on, which could lead to many companies just like not developing, not releasing these technologies. I think some might say that's the goal. I think we would argue that you want to facilitate innovation in a responsible way, not just cut it off. So there's a really interesting debate happening where you have this sort of framework that is very evidence-based, but then proposals on top of that to create more sweeping, what I would call less evidence-based provisions because of societal concerns. And I think that that's a paradigm that could probably be applied to many other issues too.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weber. Dr. Stebbins, do you have a similar example or one entirely different in biosecurity, for example?
Indeed. So following up from Kate's point, which is really well framed, I'm going to talk about an example that we have and then that we started to address. It's not fully addressed yet, of course. And then give you an example of something that's not being well addressed that you could apply the same sort of approach to. And so we already introduced this concept of addressing antibiotic resistance, which is something I worked on in the Obama administration. And essentially what it was is we recognized that there was an extraordinary rise in antibiotic resistance across the world. This is, by the way, for those who are don't have a good biology background, it simply means that our antibiotics are not working anymore on strains of bacteria because they are becoming resistant to them because of their evolving resistance to them. So the idea here was, how do we actually start to address this? And what we did was we took a multi-pronged approach, and we said, okay, so what do we need to do to respond to antibiotic-resistant cases that are on the rise, identify how big the problem is, and then prepare for the future. And in essence, what we did was we said, well, judicious use of antibiotics, both in the animal setting and in hospitals. The overwhelming majority of antibiotics are given to animals in their feed in the United States. We're talking tons of the stuff. And they don't measure it in terms of doses. They measure it in terms of pounds and tons. And then we needed new antibiotics on the market. And there's a giant market failure there because we already have tons of antibiotics. Drug companies aren't interested in making them because you only take them for a short period of time, a couple days, a week, 2 weeks, maybe. And so you would necessarily reserve new antibiotics for rough cases. Well, that's not good for business. So we drove a change in the way that BARDA, this is the agency charged with addressing biosecurity and bioterrorism issues, so that they could actually start to focus on public health problems as well. And the reasoning behind that was actually pretty straightforward, that the same types of things you would do to improve or to prepare for a biosecurity or bioterrorism event are exactly the kinds of things that you would do to prepare for a public health emergency. Improve surveillance, make sure you've got countermeasures, and make sure that you can actually do rapid tests. And we saw some of that with COVID. And what we got, so we were able to shift billions of dollars towards addressing some of these issues in and around biosecurity, both at the NIH and at BARDA. And so through their CARB-X program. And then we improved overall surveillance, that we have better data on where antibiotic resistance is cropping up. And we were able to limit the use of some antibiotics in the animal setting. Any antibiotics that are used in humans, we do not use in animal settings anymore, which is great. So those are the kinds of changes we were able to make through an executive order that I wrote for the president, and a memorandum on preferentially purchasing antibiotic-free meats for the federal government. And so that, so basically we were using the purchasing power of the government to drive a market for antibiotic-free meats. And so that was something that we also did. So the same sort of thing you can apply to something that on its surface will not seem related. And that's and it's a biosecurity issue again, and that's around cybersecurity for our health and biotechnology infrastructure of the United States. They are incredibly vulnerable to cyber attacks. There was an attack in 2017, just as a simple example, where a ransomware, it's not technically a ransomware, called NotPetya, caused Merck to lose $1.3 billion. That's one company. During the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, we saw hospitals being shut down with ransomware attacks, and the same kind of vulnerabilities that you see in these places are also exist in the research infrastructure, the hospital equipment, et cetera, for the United States. And whole hospital systems were shut down because of these cyber attacks. The NotPetya one was interesting though, because usually there's a key so they can shut off the attack. This one didn't have one. So the attackers were completely set on just disrupting the United States response to ability to respond to a public health emergency. And that was, and in addition to that, there were communication attacks that were happening that were undermining our trust in the public health system. And we saw the results of that during COVID as well. And so what we have not done is taken a serious approach to addressing this issue, because it's fundamentally hard. And that because it requires cooperation with the private sector, and it costs money to prepare for these things that could be going to other purposes within the private industry. And so we're right now sitting flat-footed on this issue. We're doing very little in the way of hardening our infrastructure. We tend to air gap them, which basically means that we don't hook them up to the internet, but most things, because of the Internet of Things, are connected to the internet in some way, so we can transfer data. And so this is a major problem that where we are already too late on it. We're going to see more attacks. We're going to see them have absolutely devastating impacts on some of our industries, and we are not ready for them. So the kind of leadership that you saw in the antibiotic resistance case could be used in this kind of situation as well, being driven out of the White House and in driving investment of federal dollars to help harden our critical infrastructure in the private sector. So that's just another example of how you can actually you can identify an issue and you can start to address it out of from the executive branch. I tend, this is just my preference, not to rely on Congress these days to address these sorts of things proactively. They're more reactive because let's face it, it's a dysfunctional body at this point. And so we have to rely much heavier on the executive branch to do more proactive interventions for these kinds of attacks. And again, it's the same type of things that you would do for any industry, but this one in particular is related to public health. So that's just another example of the way that you can start to do this. Now, before I jump off, I think everyone really has to acknowledge that Jacqueline has absolutely the cutest little cat there on her screen. Like, I just keep staring at it. It's absolutely adorable, Jacqueline. Thank you.
The joys of virtual events here.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Stebbins. Both of you have alluded to the gaps. Of course, with the Journal of Science Policy and Governance special issue, we want to throw the ball where it will be, right? Where decision makers will be in 6 months' time, a year time, 2 years' time, to be able to feed that information that influences and supports their evidence-based decision-making. So if you could dig a little deeper into, what are we not doing now that we should be doing? Open it up to either of you who want to start.
You want to start this time, Mike?
Sure, if you like. But in this case, defining the problem and the scope of the problem is going to be key. And so, if we think about what's critical for delivering healthcare, so that's hardening hospital systems, for example, because if you shut down a major hospital in certain areas of the United States, you literally shut down the ability for emergency response to sickness. So, and then, but also on the industrial side, we absolutely have to start hardening the machinery. So this is that is used. So this is everything from MRI machines to DNA sequencing machines, to et cetera, to the fermenters that are used for making drugs. Because just a slight tweak of one of those things could actually kill a batch and cost you a lot of money and a delay in response. So if they had successfully done this for the vaccines, for example, that were being made for COVID, this would have been absolutely devastating for the United States because we only had 3 at the time when they were first launched. And so so step 1 is identifying and defining the key areas where you want to have interventions. Step 2 is defining the key players in that space. And then step 3 is what is needed to address those sorts of things. And that's the kind of work that could be done through, if we had an Office of Technology Assessment still in Congress, that would have been fabulous to do work for them to do, because it's prospective work. But it's already a little bit too late because we're starting to see these attacks. And so there's an urgent need to start to address these sorts of things for the next pandemic. And so so if I'm being honest, I think this requires leadership from the White House on this particular issue if we're going to see change in it. And that would be normally for something like this that sort of bridges national security and homeland security and science and technology, a collaboration from the National Security Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy within the White House, and of course the Office of Management and Budget, to really drive an effort in this space and eventually dollars in that space, because to try and harden that infrastructure. That would be my first couple steps.
Thank you so much. Dr. Weber?
Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of thinking through how to focus the question of what we should be doing that we're not doing, given the topic of the session and my focus, in the kind of national security space and AI, other emerging digital technologies, I would say the biggest theme in what we're not doing that we should be doing more of is bringing and this goes actually to what Mike was saying too, like bringing the private sector more directly into discussions of national security and science and technology. So we have, and I'm kind of, I think, getting ahead of myself to your next question a bit, Julianne, but I think the biggest thing we're not doing is setting up public-private mechanisms to share information about what the big national security risks are for companies in the US and what measures are that can mitigate those risks. On the private sector side, useful for us, like the government has information about some of these risks that we don't have, and having some better mechanism where they're comfortable sharing that information with some individuals in the private sector, and we are in turn comfortable sharing what we are doing, and probably we're doing more at Google than maybe some smaller companies have the resources to do to protect ourselves on like the cybersecurity as an example. But still, there's more we could be doing. We could be working to, like, the government could be funding efforts to lay out best practices for industry in this space. Like, here are the list of actions you should be taking on, and this is like at a very high level. It could be done for, you know, specific types of industry or specific products as well. But here's what you should be doing in terms of like protecting against insider risks, right? Like the kinds of trainings your employees need, how to identify if you have a particular employee who has connections to a foreign intelligence service, like what you should be doing to protect from that, and how to do all of that without like unnecessarily clamping down on the open research that's going to be needed to keep us on the cutting edge of these technologies. So I think that's kind of the biggest space. I can think of lots of more specific examples. And also, as Mike was talking, you know, it occurred to me like there's this immediate problem of hardening against these cyber attacks. It's something we think a lot about too. And one of the technology spaces I cover, as you mentioned, Julian, is quantum computing. And we know that once we have a certain scale quantum computer, that's going to open up a whole new set of cybersecurity risks, because quantum computers are expected to break most current encryption. And there's a lot, you know, that's one additional specific place where there is even like going beyond the current state of the art of encryption. Like, companies need to be starting now to migrate to post-quantum cryptography. There's been some action to start that process on the US government side, but I think there's not a lot of awareness or a lot of action in the private sector to start that process. And there's real risk there. Even now, malicious actors could be downloading lots of data and storing it until this quantum computer becomes available and can encrypt that information. So just kind of understanding the trajectory of these technologies and what we need to be doing 5-10 years from now, to the extent that we can predict that, is important too.
The quantum computing is an excellent example of an area where, again, we are flat-footed. And part of the challenge here, and I want to underscore this, Kate mentioned this a little bit, is that the federal government is not well designed to work hand in hand with industry on these sorts of things. We don't have those sorts of inroads. There are notable exceptions to this, of course, but it's not something that they do as an everyday part of their work necessarily. And that's a problem when you get into areas like pharmaceuticals and biotechnology, and in cybersecurity and quantum computing and AI, where a lot of the work is happening in the private sector. And the private sector's job is not necessarily to protect national security. They have to protect the security of their intellectual property, of course. And they don't want to see the misuse of their intellectual property, of course. But it's not part and parcel of what their mission is necessarily. And so how do we actually drive change in a way that where when we absolutely need the private sector to work with the government to address these issues, and how do we define what those issues are without them? Because they are, in fact, more expert at those things, at these things than the federal government is. So.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. You know, Dr. Stebbins, your example earlier of expanding the regulatory authority of BARDA to address the antibiotic resistance issue, right? Obviously adapting existing structures, and Dr. Weber, to your example of a need for more public-private mechanisms for private company contributions to government regulation, in so much as to facilitate research rather than to clamp down, full stop. What are some examples of that happening well, in addition to BARDA, that we might be able to adapt for purposes of these biosecurity and foreign policy, AI, quantum computing issues?
Yeah, I think, you know, one of the, so there there are my colleagues in the cyber world tell me that this is kind of, Mike is saying there's a need for more of this collaboration in that space. I think there are a couple that is a space where there's maybe a bit more history of collaboration than certainly on AI or others of these emerging technologies that I'm covering, right? So there's something called the Enduring Security Framework that does, and Mike, I think you probably have more sort of visibility into what is good and bad about these existing frameworks, so please chime in. But that's an example that when we talk about this internally, we sometimes use as like, okay, we could model on this as a way of bringing together companies working in technology spaces like AI, like quantum computing, with the government to share information, to come up with these risk management best practices. I think, ideally you would have some existing part of like the NSTC, like the National S&T Council, to kind of think through this issue writ large, like what are the gaps in our if you take national security specifically, and our national security policy infrastructure, particularly that don't account for the role of today's private sector, like compared to the role of the private sector in the 70s when some of these policies were designed. It's a very different, I think that in spaces like the ones that we are working in, the large majority of cutting edge AI quantum computing research is funded by the private sector, which was not the case for the emerging technologies of 50 years ago, which were mostly funded by the government. And if something is government funded, of course, it can be classified. There's a lot more control over what is shared and what is not shared. Companies like Google, for better or worse, are known for sharing a lot of our fundamental research. And I think there are growing concerns about that. And so we understand that, but we also don't have the resources to fully, as Mike was saying, understand the national security risks. And so, we're probably not going to come to a state where like the government has the kind of oversight over our research that it has over the research it's funding, but some kind of mechanism to at least like communicate what we are doing more openly and more effectively, and then communicate on the mechanisms we already have in place to protect our work, and other things that we could consider would be a first step at least. And there may, maybe at some point down the line, some of that discussion of these protective mechanisms, like some of that needs to become more mandatory across more companies. But I think at least like the starting point is to make it easier to talk about this stuff, because where we are now is we have just proposal for export control after export control, or foreign investment controls, and these things are not actually getting to the heart of the problem. Like an export control on an AI algorithm is probably not going to be very effective, because it's hard to control an algorithm, and the technology is so far along in its development outside the United States that putting a control on what happens here is not going to stop a foreign adversary from developing the equivalent technology in most cases.
Indeed, there's an element of this of protecting the technologies that we're developing, but also developing the counter technologies. But there's also a perennial challenge in this space that we haven't really talked about, but is worth noting, I think. And that is that a lot of the work that happens in these areas, particularly around quantum computing, is classified. And so it doesn't have, so the work that the federal government is doing in that area, in that space and some other spaces, don't see the light of day and don't have a transparent discussion because of the nature of the discussions around them. So this isn't to say that nothing is happening. It's to say that they're happening, in controlled settings. However, for some of these issues, they really aren't dealing with them to the degree that they need to. And the one that I highlighted is one of them. The hardening our pharmaceutical and biotechnology and health infrastructure of the United States against cyber attacks is something that even though we do have good relations with the computer science industries, Google, for example, Microsoft, et cetera, in and around cybersecurity, we don't necessarily have as deep an effort as we need to on hardening equipment and infrastructure as the Internet of Things has grown over the last couple decades. And so we haven't done enough in some spaces, and in other spaces, we're not fully aware of what's going on. But this is actually kind of the interesting challenge of working in public policy as well, and what makes it kind of fun. As Kate was mentioning, we have some mechanisms, CFIUS, for example, which is the Committee on Investment on Foreign Investment in the United States, which regulates how foreign entities are able to buy or invest in infrastructure and technology within the United States. So can they buy a company in the United States? Well, it gets a classified review of that, and that's these are some of the mechanisms that are in place. But again, those are kind of blunt instruments for dealing with delicate problems, and that's another thing that where nuance is actually really important. And Kate, alluded to this as well, that, sometimes, the government has very blunt instruments for trying to regulate or control technologies for the purpose of national security, but they don't necessarily reflect the realities of the technology because the instruments are blunt. And so we sometimes wind up being reactive when there's a problem, rather than proactive to make sure that the problem never arises in the first place. And that's sort of what we're seeing right now in a number of different spaces.
Wonderful. Thank you for this rich discussion. I would regret if I didn't ask this question before jumping into audience posed questions. Some are calling for an Asilomar conference on AI. For those unfamiliar with the recombinant DNA conference that led to restrictions and guideposts, guardrails for recombinant DNA research 40 years ago, what would be gained or limited from that type of facilitating of future steps with AI?
Kate, do you want to take that one first, or do you want me to?
Go for it, Mike.
I have very strong opinions on this, which I think I spoke to you about the other day. So Asilomar was a convening of scientific experts in and around recombinant DNA. And then what it wound up doing is creating a moratorium on the use of recombinant DNA in the 1970s. Functionally, people now view that in a very positive light, that it was a very successful effort. I am a contrarian on that particular issue. I think all it did was delay the use of recombinant DNA technologies in the laboratory and in research labs. I don't see it, and I don't think that the kinds of things that happened as a result of Asilomar on a day-to-day basis within research labs was substantially different as a result of that pause. And so I don't view I think Asilomar might be a bit of an anachronism, and it also might not be particularly effective, because the end result of Asilomar was a pause on the development and use of those technologies. And I don't necessarily see that as a positive thing when we're in a competitive environment with other countries who are not taking the same pause. At the time, the US was by far the leader on the use of recombinant DNA technologies because of federal investments that have been made in that space. Here, we're talking about technologies that have been developed in the private sector and are being developed in other countries as well at the same time. So that kind of pause would likely just negatively impact US competitiveness and innovation, and not have the desired outcome at the end of the day. which is to protect the American economy and public from the misuse of these technologies or people leveraging these technologies for nefarious purpose.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would agree. It's probably not surprising to hear that a tech company would agree that we shouldn't be pausing the development of these technologies. I mean, I think that, you know, when people cite Asilomar as a positive example, I think that the context that typically happens in is like, oh, this created like a real sense of shared norms around how recombinant DNA technology should and shouldn't be used, so that when you have like, you know, an announcement of a human like clone in China, the global reaction kind of halts fast forward development there. I think you can get to that point without having the pause, but rather by like saying, okay, what are the specific risks here, and what are the lines that we don't think anybody should cross in use of, whether it's like, you know, how do you define what artificial general intelligence is, right? Like an AI that really is able to make its own decisions and kind of diverge from what it was programmed to do and just go out on its, like, how do you define that? What are the lines of research we need to protect against in some future, which I would say is still quite far in the future, but like, you know, what kind of research needs to be funded? We call this alignment research, to like make sure that AI is aligned with its intended purpose, which isn't always as straightforward as it seemed. Like what seems, you know, how do we, when has something gone too far? How can we kind of clamp down if at some future state we do have an AI model that becomes very concerning in that way? What are the current risks around misinformation, and how can those, you know, what guardrails can be put in place? I think there's a lot of really important work to be done, but focusing on a pause is probably not the right way of channeling that energy.
Indeed. I think the positive part of Asilomar was bringing people together who are expert on the issue to discuss the challenges around the issue. That fully support. We should definitely do a lot more of that. But with a focus on what are the practical steps that can be taken either from the private sector or the government to try and safeguard the appropriate use of these technologies. That, fully supportive of that. That makes total sense. I'm just not a fan of these of a pause, because I don't in the development or use of a technology unless you have a really urgent sense that there's going to be a problem.
Thank you so much. In a lightning round here with one more audience question about the balance of privacy, both in the AI space as well as cybersecurity, right? Dr. Stebbins, you were talking about the risk to healthcare systems and our health data. So what's the calculus there, right? How do you balance individual data privacy with what could be gained by deploying the technology further?
So this is around access to health data?
As we further expose ourselves to risks of cybersecurity that impacts health data alongside every other type of data, particularly that which is used to train up AIs, what are the conversations there at the highest levels? Indeed,
I think the positive, I think you start with the positive. By being able to train AIs and natural language processing to look at electronic health records, for example, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about health data. The positive is you can start to figure out what works in whom and when, okay? Because right now, a lot of medicine is anecdotal, the way that it's practiced today in the United States. So a single physician may have some experience with a disease, but they don't currently have the benefit of understanding what 1,000 people who had the exact same thing looked like, and what were the effective things, and sometimes more important, what didn't work. For example, in cancer, a lot of people get the wrong chemotherapy agent as their starting treatment. Well, if we could prevent that, then all the deleterious effects of that treatment that wasn't likely to work could go away. And so that's the positive part. The negative part is that, yeah, that we are seeing leaks of health data, and we're going to see more of them for sure as everything is becoming digitized and linked together and put into common formats. It's going to become more valuable. So there is an upside to this, but the reality is that health data leaks are going to become something that is going to become more and more common, and is going to be harder and harder to control. And this is particularly bad when we're talking about people's privacy in and around their health data. So what should we be doing about that? Certainly the same sorts of things that we've been talking about, which is creating constantly evolving new standards for security in and around health data to ensure that we don't have those kinds of leaks of data. But at the same time, I think we should really start communicating with people and working on opt-in programs so that people's health data can be used to really fundamentally change the way medicine works today. In the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to see a sea change in the way that people are treated, and that is a good thing. Even with existing technologies today and for how we treat patients, we are not optimizing the treatment based on all of the patients that looked like them that came before them. And that is the opportunity that we're looking at here. And in the course of exploring that opportunity and improving healthcare, we are going to see slips for sure. That it's just definitely going to happen. And it's a matter of trying to put the right safeguards in place to ensure that we minimize those kinds of leaks, most of which these days are created by human error, not based on cyber attacks.
Thank you. Dr. Weber, do you have a moment to contribute?
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add, and I think there was also kind of an AI aspect to this question specifically, and I think depending on the type of AI application, so I think that makes sense, or covered kind of the benefits, risks, like thinking about the protections we need to put in place. There's also, it's not always the case that more AI means more personal data risk. And so that's maybe a helpful point to just put out there as well. At Google, there's a lot of work being done to shift our model for serving ads on our platforms, for example, because we know there is this concern about personal data, and how can we do that? There's an effort called Privacy Sandbox that's specifically dedicated to doing that in a way that doesn't use as much personal user data. There's a lot of work being done on, for certain of the AI models that we currently deploy, like on Android phones, for example, a lot of the computation is done on your phone. Of course, that doesn't make it risk-free, but what's communicated to the servers is not the raw data, but rather an updated version of the AI model using the data from the phone. And so there are fewer points at which that data can be, that the actual user data can be leaked. And so these are issues that people in the industry are thinking about and looking for creative solutions to kind of get to the more capable AI endpoint while addressing what we know are user concerns. But that's not to diminish those concerns and all the things we need to be doing to directly address them too.
Thank you again so much. Dr. Stebbins, you wanted to add something very quickly?
I did, just very quickly. I always like to address any questions that people ask about career. For people who are interested in getting into the policy space, I cannot recommend enough people, even though I did not do one of these fellowships, I did a different one, the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. I think, Kate, you did one of these. They are a great way to get introduced into science policy in Washington. I think, Henry, weren't you in the inaugural class of these? So it's just absolutely a phenomenal program, and it is the main way that people come into Washington from PhD programs to do science policy. And they have a broad set of these policy fellowships. I have no stake in them. I wasn't even one of these fellows. I did a different fellowship program, but that's the main one, and it is responsible for launching tremendous number of very cool careers. So definitely check that out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stebbins. And yes, a big plus from Dr. Weber. It's a minute after time. You've been so generous with fielding our questions from the audience as well as from myself. It gives us such hope for the world that experts like you are at the helm of such critical topics. I want to thank once again the American Physical Society Forum on Physics and Society, and Dr. Kelly in particular, to JSPG Ambassador Bipin Kumar for helping with the technical side of things, and once again to all of you in the audience for your interest and passion to drive forward evidence-based science and technology policy. We look forward to your submissions by the April 30th deadline to our special issue. And participants also, you can expect an email confirming the YouTube video upload once we get that up by the end of the week. Thank you again, Dr. Stebbins, Dr. Weber. It's been an enormous honor to showcase such leaders as yourselves. Thank you very much once again for your time.
Thank you for inviting us. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.